there's been endless conversations over the last few years on the crisis in the liberal international order, and the truth is it's not what a Heartland voter in Iowa right now is thinking about. They don't even know there's a crisis in the liberal international order. Never mind, if you put a gun to their head, could they define what this liberal international order is? Even in capitals in Washington or Berlin today, there's a huge dispute over how you even define this order, never mind whether you bemoan its passing or not. What you would hear from the Trump administration is a notion of American leadership that still exists, but that is perhaps louder, brusquer, more unilateral and independent-minded than its previous incarnations. They would say, I think, that it befits a more Darwinian realpolitik world in which it's one of great power competition, defining it rather than essentially the coalition politics approach of the late Cold War and the early post-Cold War. That may be to give too intellectual of a gloss on it. There are certainly many who disagree, both in Washington and here in Europe, of course. I guess what I would say is that if you pull back even farther, in simple numeric reductionist terms, of course there's been a decline, a relative decline in American power and American leadership as it was a very anomalous situation in the aftermath of World War II that the United States would have such economic and therefore political dominance around the world. That has been eroding. That trend is not going to change. Demographics and geopolitics suggest that's where we're headed. Really the question is what the United States wants to do about it. And that's where nostalgia is probably dangerous all around. It seems to me that it's a sign of our times that we're actually asking ourselves, well, gee, can you come up with something optimistic about the transatlantic relationship at this moment in time? I do think there's a scenario in which, in a weird way, President Trump's criticism of Europe has put the issue of Europe back on the table. It's forced Americans as well as Europeans to reevaluate the importance of the relationship, and for those who are deeply invested in it, for them to say, well, we may be back to first principles, in the same way that as a journalist, on the one hand, I can say, well, it's a terrible and disturbing thing for the President of the United States to call journalists the enemies of the people. The flip side is it's made clarity of mission a lot easier, and it's made it a lot clearer to people that rights are not simply something to be taken for granted, and alliances are not simply something to be taken for granted. So I do think there's a scenario where you could see a future president, either Democrat or Republican, who comes in and says, there's trouble between the United States and Europe, and we need to reaffirm what this partnership is going to be about going forward. So I don't think we know how the story ends yet. It's an interesting question when it comes to young people and whether they're going to be invested in the transatlantic alliance in the same way that their fathers, their grandfathers, mothers were. We keep invoking the historical memory of World War II and the end of the Cold War over and over and over again. But I'm reminded when I was the editor of Foreign Policy magazine a few years ago, and somebody was talking about the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I had a very young editorial staff, and they said, oh, well, Susan, you remember the fall of the Berlin Wall as if this was, like some prehistoric event, and I felt bad about that. Then I met a great journalist I told this story to, and he said, well, that's okay, Susan, I covered when they put the wall up, so. But, look, nostalgia, as Friedrich Merz observed this morning at the conference, is not a strategy for the future. And I think it's a huge challenge going forward, especially because already you're seeing one of the biggest fissures in our divided society in the United States, the fissure between generations.